is about those home DNA test stuff. So, as you can see here, 23andMe. I know there was like another one. I think it's called Ancestry Tree or something. Ancestry Tree. Free Ancestry. Ancestry. It's just called Ancestry. Okay. Okay. So, this interested me because I think some of my family has done it, though. I'm good. I'm fine. Yeah. So, genetic discrimination is coming for all of us. Let's see how we're doomed.
If you've been keeping up with the news lately, you might have seen that 23andMe, the DNA testing company, is going through a spot of trouble as of late. The company's down over 98% in the last 5 years alone. They have laid off around 40% of their workforce, and also their entire board of directors resigned recently.
Wow.
Basically, they are not doing great at the moment. And if you are one of the more than 15 million people who've used 23andMe, or one of the more than 26 million people who've used any at-home DNA testing service, you might have a few questions, right? One such question would be, what happens to all of their DNA data? And we might...
Yeah. I used to consider doing this, but I'm more concerned about some megacorp owning my DNA profile. Yeah. I don't know. I always was kind of interested too, but then at the same time, I'm like, I don't really care, so...
be starting to get some answers as to what's happening on that front. A really interesting article was published in the Atlantic, the kindly titled "Genetic Discrimination is Coming for Us All," in which they describe the story of a man named Bill. Bill had two family members who'd died of ALS, the condition that Stephen Hawking most famously had. And because of this, he decided to get a DNA test to figure out...
Oh, true. Yeah, true. A lot of people do it because of like medical stuff. They already own it from the hospital. Oh, yeah. Yeah. If you think your personal information and stuff isn't out there already, think again. They have everything. They have everything.
Out whether he was at an increased risk of developing the condition. Bill was otherwise a healthy 60-year-old man, and it turned out that he had a gene that made him somewhat more likely than the average to develop ALS. He didn't have the disease. Bill did what, most smart people would do in this situation, which was to seek out some form of long-term care insurance. Except the problem was, when he approached his insurance agent about this, the person who makes a living from selling insurance, she told him that he basically shouldn't bother because he wouldn't be approved. He'd have to rely on his own income if he were to fall ill. In the US, at least, it is a legal requirement that you have to report genetic information to certain types of insurance.
If the insurer asks you whether you've undergone genetic testing, you generally must disclose it. Wait, what? I'm going back. What did this say? Genetic tests can hurt your chances of getting some types of insurance. What? Oh my god, because they're like, oh well, you have this now, so we're not gonna cover it. It's like with pet insurance too. Like, if your pet has something happen, and then you try to apply for insurance, they're like, no, we're not covering that.
A legal requirement that you have to report genetic information to certain types of insurance. It doesn't matter whether it's an at-home one or one with your doctor. You have to tell them the results. Otherwise, it's insurance fraud, which is crazy. But the irony is that he wouldn't have sought out this insurance had he not taken the test. It's a bit of a catch-22. And this isn't like a particularly unique story. A quick Google will find a number of stories where people have discussed being ineligible or facing increased insurance premiums because of the results of a genetic test. There's a real risk that this genetic discrimination, as we call it, is going to become a bit more widespread as more and more people take such DNA tests. And as the companies who issue those tests begin to collapse, it could be very easy to consider what the risks are to our genetic code and end up in a place which is like, Bill Gates wants to inject Windows Vista into my left arm. But this is one of those cases where I think like reality is often scarier than conspiracy.
Yeah, like, God forbid you want to try and prepare yourself for some disease you might have. Holy shit.
I think it makes sense to start with the companies that have arguably played the biggest role in pushing forward this concept of genetic discrimination, whether they wanted to or not. Companies like 23andMe, MyHeritage DNA, or Ancestry DNA. These companies have like a super broken business model. A DNA testing kit is something that most people only buy once, usually as a novelty, and therefore the companies have had to be a bit more creative in how they monetize. The first thing they tried was subscription plans, or everyone's favorite solution. Obviously, nobody wanted this. Nobody wants more subscriptions. Another scheme.
Why would you subscribe? What? Hold on, I'm going back again. We're gonna see with these subscriptions. So, $149 for your first year, and then it's $368. What the heck? An annual membership with access to new premium reports and features? Are you kidding? Wow, like the kits are expensive enough. And then you get your thing and then you have to pay to access your information. So you get your kit plus access to reports that help you learn about your heart health, how you process certain medications, trace your family's journey through time. Oh my gosh.
Obviously, nobody wanted this. Nobody wants more subscriptions.
No.
Another scheme they tried was DNA-based holidays. You can go on a vacation based on your DNA. Also didn't work very well. And this kind of leaves 23andMe and all of these other companies in a bit of a sticky situation. Without a way to actually make a profit, they've had to rely on the one most obviously profitable thing that they have: millions of people's genetic information.
Oh my God.
And if we actually just like read 23andMe's privacy policy, the thing that everyone signs but nobody actually reads, you see that they actually claim to never share the data with employers, insurance companies, or public databases without your explicit consent. Sounds pretty good. But much like every privacy policy, I guess, there are some loopholes in there.
Ugh.
We love ourselves a little loophole. Because this doesn't mean that your information isn't shared at all, right? Rather, what it means is that if you just buy a stake in the company, they'll let you access the data. This is what happened with 23andMe. They took a $300 million investment from the pharmaceutical company GlaxoSmithKline for an ownership stake in the company. And as part of that deal, GSK also got a license to access data. And when we pair this fact that data has already been sold off with the various hacks that 23andMe have had, then it kind of paints a picture where your genetic data might not be as safe as you think it is with these companies. And even in the case where it is safe, it's quite likely to just get sold off to the highest bidder. Genetic testing companies are also not protected by HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And it basically means that your data has to comply with a bunch of security regulations. 23andMe are not subject to such laws because they aren't healthcare companies. And, I'm not going to say that has to do with them getting hacked, but maybe it might be related. And, you might like say like, so what, right? Like we need better medicine, obviously. And this trove of genetic information might be the place to develop new drugs, new medicines to help, help the masses. But
I mean, like, okay, true, but you need their consent.
I think that we've ended up in a situation where this is having an unintended side effect, really. All of these fears, these hacks, these sales of data to private companies have, without a doubt, affected the public confidence in genetic testing as a whole. There are a number of reports and articles that discuss the fact that genetic studies that are being carried out in a university or in a hospital are really struggling to find people because people don't trust that their data will be safe. They don't understand what's going to be done with it. And they're therefore quite reluctant to even sign up in the first place. This is obviously a pretty bad thing because it doesn't really apply for pharmaceutical companies like GSK, who can simply rely on the fact that you didn't read the terms and conditions properly and you just pressed agree to get your data. And so the big benefit of this trove of genetic data isn't distributed equally. It's distributed massively in favor of whatever condition is profitable in the current climate. And the negative side effects are affecting public research, and that would benefit way more people. This idea of genetic discrimination has been a talking point since like the 90s when the Human Genome Project was underway. And in the US, it resulted in a law being passed called GINA, which is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. In Canada,
Okay.
we have the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, GNDA, which was passed in 2017. So these laws exist, and yet they haven't done much to alleviate public fears. One of the reasons why it hasn't happened, in the US at least, is because the law that was passed has like quite a few specific exceptions and loopholes. The forms of insurance that people would most need after taking a genetic test, like life insurance, care, or disability insurance, are all excluded, meaning that they
What? Gina cannot request genetic info, can request genetic info, life insurance, long-term care insurance, disability insurance, military employees. Hello, Eli! Welcome in, welcome in!
they can legally ask you to provide your genetic information. And if you've taken a test, you're committing insurance fraud if you don't give them it. It does apply to health insurance and employers, so they legally can't ask you. But all these other kinds of insurance, as well as the military, can ask you for your genetics as well. Despite the fact that the military actually says that you shouldn't take one of these at-home DNA tests. The world is bigger than just the US, right? So like, what's going on outside of America in this space? Are people still worried about this idea outside of the US? Is this just like an American distrust of institutions? Well, I stumbled across this paper which tried to look at Canadian life insurance and figure out whether or not they are still asking for genetic information after this law was passed. And the paper found that the new law had a modest impact on the practices of life insurers, because instead of asking directly for your genetic information, they resorted to a different strategy, which is to ask kind of open-ended questions that could inadvertently lead someone to disclosing private information. The questions would use terms like asking if you'd ever taken a diagnostic test that you wanted to disclose, without necessarily always being clear that you had the legal right to not disclose any genetic test results. And, you know, the average person is scared of committing insurance fraud, and their way around it has been to...
Yeah. I am definitely afraid of committing insurance fraud. What about you guys?
rely on the fact that people don't necessarily understand what they legally have to disclose and what they legally don't have to disclose. Similar broad questions about, you know, any test results or family histories could inadvertently lead people to disclose genetic information. And it can be really unclear for the average person whether or not they should be handing over this genetic information, or whether or not doing it is a form of fraud. But, you know, aside from the aspect of just insurance, who are likely the main beneficiaries of having access to troves of genetic information, there's like a second whole side to this discussion, I think, which is about the more subtle discrimination that people are afraid of and that engenders these fears in spite of there being laws in a number of countries that should alleviate the fears. I found this paper from Belgium, and these two ladies interviewed people who'd taken genetic tests and had found out that they were at an increased risk of developing one of these two conditions, either breast cancer or Huntington's. And talking to them about what their fears were in terms of discrimination actually brings out like a whole new side. They weren't always about necessarily a problem filling in an insurance form, but also just about how their peers and people in society at large would treat them if they knew their genetic information. This one person said that before I informed people at work about the mutation, I used to always be responsible for signing certain forms for the company. And then suddenly, after talking about HD, someone else was asked to do this instead of me. I was like,
what? I don't understand. What? That's crazy. Oh my gosh. It's kind of concerning, I guess, that more and more people don't know about this side of DNA testing. Like, what the frig? Most people I know who wanted to do this was just like, oh yeah, it would be fun. And that's it. That's as far as it goes. It would be fun. Not, oh, I'm gonna do this and now I have to make sure I tell all my doctors and stuff that I did the DNA testing so that they can charge me an insurance premium or just not give me insurance at all. And The reason I did it in the first place was so that I could prepare myself. Insurance fraud. With my luck, I don't have to do it. I'm already an expert. I'm hurting myself. Oh my gosh. Oh man. Kitsuya, you must be more careful. So you don't keep hurting yourself on accident.
Like, oh no, would this have anything to do with my Huntington risk? And this is like a gray area, right? It's this space in between is in large part where people's fears lie. They often describe this idea of being scared of being treated as a weaker or a less competent individual in society at large because of the result of a genetic test. Despite the fact that they are fully healthy, it particularly is acute amongst people, as I found out in these interviews, who've had family members who've been particularly ill and have seen how people with disabilities have been treated at large. They know what's coming for them effectively, and it's quite scary. And this is not to necessarily downplay some of the successes of genetic databases, because genetic databases have been used to identify like serial killers, for example. And this is obviously a great thing, right? They've also been used to make progress towards curing certain conditions, which is obviously also a great thing. But it's not really necessarily about the outcomes as much as it is about the process as well. And the process needs to have like informed consent, right? And we need to ensure that people, first of all, know what they're signing up for, because they're not going to read terms and conditions. And also the privacy policy of a company like 23andMe only lasts as long as the company lasts. Ultimately, the big problem here is, once again, it is the result of like a highly for-profit healthcare system that incentivizes, extracting every bit of value out of every bit of information, independent of concerns like privacy. 23andMe's fine for losing half of their customers' data was $30 million, whereas the investment they got from GSK was $300 million. The fines and the punishments are a flash in the pan compared to the potential for reward if you just break the rules. This is not an unsolvable problem, because literally a couple of months ago, Australia passed a total ban on the use of genetic testing results in life insurance, because there isn't necessarily inherently a reason why a life insurer should get access to this data. The onus on requiring someone to read the terms and conditions is obviously silly, because nobody reads that. We need something a little bit stricter than a tick box that determines whether or not your genetic info is at risk of being sold. Solving these fears isn't something that can be done purely through like legal measures, because, if making things illegal stopped them from happening, we'd have a zero crime rate by now, right? We need an economic shift away from incentivizing this kind of behavior, and also a cultural shift where having a gene for, say, breast cancer or Huntington's doesn't mean that you live a lower quality life than anyone else.
Damn. That's so stupid. Like, most people would get these genetic tests, for their own information, so they know what diseases to look for if they need to watch out for something that they could develop. And then the insurance friggin' companies are just gonna go and be like, oh, well, you did this genetic test, so sad, cry me a river, now we're not gonna cover you if anything happens. Or, or we'll charge you $1,000 instead of $500 or some stupid bullshit. What the heck? And if that's like required, I didn't even know that was a requirement. They should explicitly put that like right front and center when you're buying these things. Holy crap. I had no idea. It's kind of scary.